Okay, well, with that, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Eugene Planning Commission meeting for December 7th, 2021. Thank you for joining us in this remote meeting format that we're continuing to use as the community recovers from the COVID-19 pandemic. This format allows us to meet and to take care of our business while we keep our members, staff, and the public safe. Today, we're going to continue deliberations on the draft land use code and the Metro Plan amendments that are required to implement Oregon House Bill 2001. I do want to note as we get started that anyone wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream. It's available on our website. Watch the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21 or by following the access instructions that are listed on the agenda for the meeting. If you join the meeting via computer, device, or phone, your microphone, your webcam, and phone will be automatically muted when you enter the meeting as an attendee. So with that, I want to move to agenda item A, deliberations, middle housing code amendments, and turn it over to Terry Harding. Terry.
Thank you, Commissioner Beeson. Get this in full screen mode. How's that look? Can you see my notes or am I all good? All good?
All good.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the thumbs up. That's super helpful. So as Commissioner Beeson said, we're here to deliberate on the middle housing code amendments. Tonight, we'll do a little refresher, which is always good to do because we have folks tuning in from the public. So we'll briefly go over the project goals and some introductory information. Then we'll delve into your deliberations items for tonight and then wrap up with next steps. Middle housing project goals are number one, to comply with House Bill 2001. So as we are doing that, we are also attempting to further other work that the city has been trying to achieve over the long term. And they include furthering equity and long-term housing affordability and enabling housing availability and diversity of type. This chart shows our latest schedule for the adoption phase. We're here in December. We're wrapping up Planning Commission work, hopefully in January, and then sending a recommendation to the City Council. Council will hold a second public hearing in March, date to be determined, and deliberate after that. If Eugene's local code is not adopted or on substantive appeal on June 30th, 2022, the state's model code will apply in Eugene. I brought this slide back. You might recognize it from your meeting in January 2021. We spent the fall of 2020 doing a lot of outreach with various groups to inform the writing of the code. And one of the main products of that fall outreach is the values and principles. We shared them back in January. They were written by city staff. They're longer statements than these. These are just kind of the short headings. Suggested by the outreach groups in the fall. And many of the themes were suggested by more than one group. So I'm reminding you of these because these were on staff's mind as we were helping write sections of code to bring to you. And many of these themes show up in the public testimony that you heard at your hearing or have received in writing. So I'll just read them so we have them in the record. They're equity and access to housing, broad dispersal of middle housing, housing options of all shapes and sizes, compact, efficient housing, a sense of belonging, opportunities to build wealth, the interconnectedness of housing solutions, and vibrant neighborhoods. So together, the values and principles were used by staff as we worked with the consultants to draft code and policy language to implement the law. And it just feels like a great moment to revisit these. Another reminder that some of the themes from the outreach that we did are summarized on this slide, and they are to focus on equity and inclusion as code choices are made, to overall encourage and incentivize middle housing across the community, near transit routes, to encourage compact development by reducing parking requirements, and then to pursue incentives and programs beyond the code as part of our ongoing housing work. Staff published a guide to the adoption process, and you'll see these tables pop up again as Jeff leads you through some of the items for tonight. But they are available, all of the tables, in the guide to the adoption process on our website. And this email address is still active, although your soft record has closed. Emails sent to this email address will be forwarded to the City Council for their consideration. And that's middlehousingtestimony@eugene-or.gov. The information in the tables compares for a bunch of different standards what the minimum standard is in the state rules. In the center column, what would be applied under the model code. And then in the right-hand column, what the proposal is for Eugene's code. And then the colored boxes indicate whether the proposal would encourage or incentivize middle housing or allow it. And that would be a yellow box. This is a reminder from our last meeting, and just to iterate again for the public and the commission, middle housing affordability can be encouraged in the draft code. It cannot be expressly required. So on the left-hand column, you see things that the code can do and already does to help encourage more attainable or lower cost housing, sometimes called lowercase a affordable housing. We can simply allow more by reducing lot sizes and allowing both detached and attached plexes for flexibility. We can increase design flexibility and reduce regulations, which leads to more housing opportunities. And we can add incentives tied to affordability, such as the small unit lot area and parking reductions. We did produce an affordability FAQ that's on our website that you can find at Middle Housing on the City of Eugene's website. And that's really the end of my introduction. Now I'm going to stop sharing and give it over to Jeff because he's prepared some slides to walk you through tonight's deliberation topics.
Thanks, Terry. Good evening, everyone. And good evening, commissioners. So tonight we're round 2 of deliberations. So I'm gonna really quickly share my screen. That's the world we live in. All right, so, excuse me. I'm going to start by just working through the remaining definitions. As you'll recall, we were kind of going through those to make sure that everybody had a good foundational perspective for the rest of the, for how those kind of operate within the rest of the code. And then we're going to move into the actual development standards and design standards that apply to middle housing. During this phase of it, as Terry mentioned, I'm actually going to be showing you the tables that were provided through the adoption process. So we're going to try to take a little bit higher level approach. And if we want to look at any specific code standards, we can do so at that time. But we're going to kind of take a higher level approach to those as opposed to where in the definitions, I'll be showing you the actual code. So without any further ado, I'm going to dive right back into where we were, into the code and into the draft definitions. And this version that we're looking at here is version 2 of the definitions, which was given to you as part of this AIS. That was, so basically this has incorporated those changes that you all agreed to as part of the November 30th deliberations meeting. So we were in the middle of talking about kind of what constitutes the different types of dwellings for the middle housing. And so we had talked a little bit about duplexes, which, you know, it's 2 dwellings on a lot in any configuration. A single family home and an ADU don't constitute a duplex. A fourplex is 4 dwellings on a single lot in any configuration. Multi-unit dwellings are now 5 or more units. So that's a shift into how we also apply the multi-unit standards. Dwelling, single unit, we changed that terminology away from single detached. Dwelling, townhouse, a dwelling that is part of a townhouse project, 2 or more attached dwellings, where each dwelling is located on an individual lot or parcel. So one thing I want to just kind of take a pause and a step back here, because there's been a few really good questions about the difference between a townhouse and a fourplex. And it is entirely possible to develop a fourplex, so 4 units on a single lot that look, act, and quack like a townhouse. They can just appear as a townhouse, but because they're on a single lot and it's 4 dwellings on a lot, it would be a fourplex. That same thing could be done for a duplex or a triplex. What makes a townhouse different is it's the fact that it is an attached dwelling that is on its own lot. So that specific caveat is really important. So when you're thinking about how those things apply, just remember that it can be a townhouse sometimes if they're on their own lots, or a fourplex other times. This same really nuanced issue also comes up with fourplexes and cottage clusters. A cottage cluster is 4 or more detached units. So you could have 4 units that are cottage clusters, so that have a courtyard and the cottage cluster standards apply. Or you could just have a fourplex and have 4 detached units that look like cottages and have a courtyard. And they can choose at the time of development permit, essentially, they would indicate which type of dwelling they're going to be going after. So please raise your hand if you have any questions about that. I hope that's pretty clear at this point. Yeah, Commissioner Taylor, go ahead.
Thanks. I don't have particular questions around that. I just wanted to make sure, because I know we've already passed it. In the duplex, I looked at that, and a duplex can be attached or detached, right? I just want to make sure. We had talked about that in earlier meetings, and I just want to make sure it allows, the code's clear that it can be either attached or detached, because I know the state allows for that flexibility.
That's spot on. We do allow for detached plexes. In this case, the state definitions, you would see the word attached. So 2 dwelling units attached in any configuration. Whereas ours says just in any configuration, which gives you that flexibility for them to be attached or detached. All right, so looking at some of the other definitions that have changed, so we've got triplex, again, 3 dwellings on a lot in any configuration. We specified with front lot lines that traditionally, or the definition of front lot lines had that measured off of access easements. And because access easements are used so commonly, especially in middle housing developments, this has caused a lot of problems in the past, just generally regarding development. And we saw a lot of issues moving forward. So we decided to make sure that the front lot line is when it's abutting a public street or private street. Some of these other changes are more just to ensure that there's clarity around what constitutes a middle housing development versus other developments like a manufactured home or dwelling park. We defined the middle housing generally. We have middle housing lots, and again, that's associated with the middle housing land division. So middle housing lots are their own special thing. They're not typical lots. These are lots that are created through the middle housing land division for home ownership opportunities. They do not constitute a traditional standard lot. And we also have the definition of middle housing land division. And so that's a partition or subdivision that is to create middle housing lots. So you use the middle housing land division to specifically create middle housing lots. And then there's some other changes that are mostly associated with the swap out of the word and usage of family. And then lastly is Townhouse Project. And a townhouse project is essentially just a grouping of various townhouses in a larger development site. So I'm Commissioner Taylor, I see your hand is raised.
I just want, because I know this came up in public testimony quite frequently, is I just want to get a clarification on the manufactured home dwelling park. So, but you can still have manufactured dwellings that are that are a cottage cluster, right? It's just, so this is just saying it does not include a development permitted. So it's just distinguishing that you have to actually go in and permit and allocate that you are pursuing a fourplex or a cottage cluster, similar to other portions of the code, right?
That's exactly right. You could, at the time of development permit, you'd indicate that you're developing a manufactured home or dwelling park, if that's the thing that you want to develop, and therefore those standards would apply. Or if you're just putting manufactured dwellings onto a property as part of a fourplex, then that's also okay. And you'll indicate that at the time of development permit. And so with that, those are the, that kind of wraps it up for definitions. And so I'm going to go back to my actual presentation here. And so now I'm going to dive into the actual middle housing development standards, design standard, and lot standards. And again, this is an opportunity to take a higher level approach. I'm not going to be showing you the draft code. You've had an opportunity to review that. If there is a specific piece of code language or a specific standard that you want to look at more closely, please just let me know, and I'll bring that that document up and we can look at that together, and we can and then you'll have a chance to deliberate on that specifically. So generally speaking, we're going to be looking today at what planners refer to as the 2700s, which are the residential zone development standards. So those are things like minimum lot sizes, frontages, lot widths, setbacks, heights, lot coverage, open space, things like that. We're also going to look at the middle housing special development standards. So there's those standards that apply specifically to either a triplex, fourplex, cottage cluster, or townhouses. And then lastly, we'll take a look at those standards that we are changing in association with this project that come from the 9.6 thousands. And that's basically standards that apply to all development that happens in Eugene. And that can be anything from stormwater requirements to tree preservation to street standards and things like that. So one thing you'll probably notice is that there's not actually that much changing in there, and I'll highlight those specific changes that we're talking about today. I did want to bring this up. I think Terry already touched on it briefly, that you're going to be seeing within the table the three different options highlighted in yellow, green, or blue as to whether the standards that we're proposing as part of City of Eugene's proposal fall into the category of allow, encourage, or incentivize. Whereas allow is just basically matching the model code standards. Encourage is reducing some barriers and lessening those restrictions from the model code. And then incentivizing is really going even further to reduce those barriers. And just one thing I would like to note is that you're continuing to either loosen standards or reduce barriers. And one thing to consider is that at this point in the draft code, one of the primary tools that you have to do that would be to actually remove development standards or design standards from middle housing. And so if you do have interest in that, please be sure to flag that tonight. That's one of those ways that, design standards usually traditionally affect the overall cost of development. And so because that much consideration has to go into it. So there's been a lot of interest in thinking about lowercase affordability, so lowering the cost of housing. And so that's one thing to be considering tonight as we go through this. Commissioner or Chair Beeson.
So I think this is not a big thing, but I have been thinking all along that allow was basically the OAR, or was the Oregon code kind of the minimum, the code we have to comply with, and then we can be more flexible than that. We can encourage or incentivize, but I wasn't thinking of allow being the model code. Have I just been thinking wrong? Or does it may not?
I see Lauren's hand that just popped up, so I'll let her answer.
Well, I'd say one other thing real quick. When I go through the detail of all the amendments, it seems to me a number of times there's quite a bit of difference between the model code and the minimum. Thanks.
Commissioner Beeson, you're not wrong. I think the chart that Jeff has put together is a little bit of a shorthand. Allow means to comply with the law, whether that is the minimum standards, sometimes are a little bit different than the model code, sometimes they're the same as the model code. So sometimes it may be pulling a standard directly from the model code, sometimes it may be our own standard that does enough to comply with minimum standards. But I think another way to think of allow is just we are complying with what the law requires. Encourage and incentivize are removing barriers, being more flexible, offering more opportunities than what the law would require.
Okay, well, that's good. I don't need to be too hung up on it. I'll kind of reframe the way my own little personal talking points. So thanks.
And Terry, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, just to try to clarify this, maybe for commission and the public, I think this is accurate what is on the screen in terms of the design standards example, because it says allow model code standards for key features, and it talks about design standards. And then the encourage option is less restrictive standards, and incentivize, same thing. In the adoption guide to the adoption package, there's different language, and it does refer to the minimum standards. So I just want to be clear that you're not misremembering that, Commissioner Beeson. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Terry. Yeah, I would definitely point people to the adoption process, the guide to the adoption process, which has better language than my shorthand version that I just threw on the screen. So with that, so we're gonna kind of go through this by dwelling type, just like it's shown in the guide to the adoption process. And so what I'll do is I'll briefly introduce these topics, and if anybody would like to deliberate, ask questions, or look at the development standards more closely, please raise your hand. And before I get started, I did see that Commissioner Freidel raised her hand.
Thanks, Jeff. I just wanted to check in real quick about how you're numbering using that quick guide that you sent us for deliberation topics. Are the page numbers that you provided, are they the actual page number on the document itself, or are they the PDF page number?
They're the document in the upper right-hand corner of the actual document.
Okay, great, thanks.
So not the PDF page number, just to be clear. And just for everybody's benefit, when I pulled these snapshots of the guide to the adoption process, we're literally just going down the page. I did those in the order that they appear in the adoption guide. All right, so starting with duplexes, this is probably one of the biggest things is minimum lot size. The commission introduced that they would like duplexes to be allowed on lots that are 2,250 square feet. So staff made that change to exempt duplexes from the density standards and allow them on lots that are 2,250 square feet. And we also made that change to the lot standards table, though we, as you'll remember from item 7, we still need to find a fix for that we will bring back to the commission at a later date. The second item on this page is minimum frontage, essentially allowing standard lots that are, we call them interior lots, to be 20 feet. So this is the frontage on a street, to be 20 feet instead of the standard 50, which is what a single detached dwelling requires. And the same goes for corner lots, curb lots, whereas our cul-de-sac bulb lot is still 35 feet. And so with that, I'll ask if there are any questions. Commissioner Friday, I see you have your hand raised. Oh, sorry, that might have been a holdover. If there are no questions, I will move on. So the following 4 standards, we're looking at minimum lot width. Again, this is just a reduction to 20 feet for most lots, whereas flag lots and the cul-de-sac bulb lots stay the same as for single detached dwellings or single unit dwellings. The minimum front yard setbacks, as well as minimum interior yard setbacks, so basically all setbacks on properties, we have chosen to not change those at this time. So based on Planning Commission's consideration at an earlier date, the setbacks are not changing. The maximum height is proposed to increase from 30 feet to 35 feet. Just to make this abundantly clear, people in the testimony, you'll see reference to 42 feet oftentimes, and that comes from a provision that already exists within the code that allows the extension of an additional 7 feet when you have a roof pitch of 6 by 12. So basically a 45-degree angle for a roof pitch. You can go have an additional 7 feet of space for a building. And so that already exists in code. So when we increase it to 35, that provision will also apply to middle housing. So it could be 42 feet at the peak, roof peak. And with that, I will open it up for any questions. All right, seeing none at this time, I'll move on. Minimum off-street parking, 1 space per duplex dwelling unit. So that's the allow option. The design standards, basically it's the same design standards that apply to single unit dwellings, which there are none effectively. So beyond the development standards that exist for all development. So that's also the allow option, and that's probably appropriate. And then the last one is maximum lot coverage, where the commission had previously said that they would like to increase the lot coverage from 50%, which is what it currently is, up to 75%. And I see Commissioner Ramey's hands up.
Thank you, Jeff. I want to ask the commission to revisit the 75% encourage number. I did a little thinking about this and thinking about it in terms of what's livability and what we can do about livability. And livability is really access to light and air and tree canopy and sort of unbuilt space in neighborhoods. So the ways we can control this are setbacks, coverage, and height. And I'm personally okay with the setbacks we've chosen and the height, and I think that's good, what we've done. But the coverage is when we get, especially when we get to the larger lots, it doesn't seem necessary in order to provide a buildable amount of land. It doesn't seem that we need to have a 75% coverage. So the setbacks are getting us quite a bit of open space on the smaller space lots. So and it doesn't apply to duplexes, I don't think, Jeff, but to my way of thinking would be 5,000 square feet and up, we would reduce the coverage to 60%, which would then allow for more access to open space on those size lots. It would also allow for more tree canopy coverage, but at the same time would allow for what's a reasonable buildable area on those lots. So that's what I would like the commission to consider. And I think it makes more sense in the tris and the quads than it does in the duplexes, or it has more effect.
And really quickly, just for everybody's benefit, I'll just do a brief reminder of what constitutes lot coverage and what's included. I just want to make sure that's really clear as we enter this discussion. Lot coverage is any portion of a lot when viewed from above, so site plan view, would be covered by a building or structure or any part thereof. The only things that's not included are roof eaves or anything without a roof or carports or porches that are pretty much open on all sides. So when you're thinking about lot coverage, make sure that you're putting it in that frame of mind, according to the definition. And sorry, Commissioner Taylor, I see your hands up.
I just want to get a clarification of what Commissioner Ramey said. It looks like the 75% is proposed for duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, townhouses. So it's across the board. That's how it's currently in the draft. Yeah, I'm still, I guess I really want to support, I mean, while I recognize the importance of what you're identifying, I also really appreciate the fact that we have UGBs, we have large areas outside our urban growth boundary that actually is designated to ag land, as you know, forest land, and internally we have a pretty vibrant and it's urban forest. Now, could we, we need to maintain it. I think our housing crisis is at a stage right now in our evolution that I would like to see housing occur, and I don't think it's going to occur tomorrow. I think allowing and opening up opportunities, and then obviously this code will not be the only time we get to touch it, you know, as we move through time, being able to look at what the potential implications are, the big code adoptions of all of them, like the original one that Luku Light in 2001 was adopted. It's touched again, it's modified, it's looked at. And so personally, I think that's where I stand. Is I appreciated our prior discussion, and I do appreciate you bringing that up, because there's a lot of push and pull in the various code requirements. So that, I guess that's my position. Thank you.
Commissioner Edwards.
Thanks, Jeff. I definitely appreciate the direction that Commissioner Ramey is kind of putting out there. I think how I'm looking at it is it's not a mandate. It doesn't mean you have to build to 75%, but I think that allowing for those provisions, I think it provides greater flexibility. And then just like Commissioner Taylor mentioned, I think it really, this is going to be such a slow process. And you know, it's not going to happen overnight, but I do think that we can allow for some things that are just kind of maximum allowances that, like I said, they aren't mandates, they aren't requirements. As I think about my own, you know, neighbors or whatever, and my own sunlight or whatever else, it doesn't, I guess I'm not really understanding how their lot coverage would impact that, because they could be 5 feet from me regardless. And so it doesn't, you know, whether they fill up their whole space or they just go right up to my fence 5 feet away from it, it still is, and that's actually happening. So I just want to make that clear. I'm like, that, you know, that's living in the urban environment. So you know, I guess I just, in thinking about what that looks like in the built environment, I really do think that allowing for more flexibility is where I'd like to see us kind of move towards. So.
Commissioner Ramey, your hand was up next, and Commissioner Chair B.
Oh, okay, well, I'll take another bite at the apple then. So yes, remember we're moving from 50, we're at 50 now. So I'm not saying go back to 50. I'm saying everything you're saying. What I'm saying is let's make the step smaller for those larger lots and err on the conservative side. Of course, we can revisit this in the future. I'm just saying let's make the default be a more gentle step, little more conservative, a little more that errs on the side of access to air and light and urban canopy. It's still an increase, but we're dropping that down for the larger lots. I was really struck by some of the larger lots, which you could build out fully to all of the setbacks, and that's 75% coverage. So it seemed to me that that was too much, and it wasn't necessary in terms of the buildable land that was left over. So that's where I was coming from.
Commissioner Ramey, could you say your proposal one more time? What the break between the two sizes?
Oh, I was looking at the 5,000 square foot lots and up, moving those to 60% coverage. So the smaller lots you could still cover at 75, and I believe the numbers are that the setbacks are going to govern for the smaller lots. So there's an inflection point around 5,000 feet where you start to being governed more by coverage. I'm sorry, this is getting way into the weeds here, but that's why I was picking that number. And it still allows you to have, again, a buildable lot, and it tracks nicely on the curve, but it doesn't go as far as what makes me uncomfortable. I guess what I'm trying to say. I was more comfortable with 60% than with 75%.
Thanks. I'm kind of torn on it. I've been thinking about this one too. I think I'm landing though, as I listen, on the side of leaving it at 75 across the board. And as I was listening to Commissioner Taylor and Commissioner Edwards, I don't have specific data on this, but one way I'm thinking about it, as Commissioner Edwards said, this is going to happen over a very long period of time. It's going to be pretty gradual, I think. And also, we're talking about a fraction of the lots in Eugene that are going to, where there's going to be occasion for someone to build middle housing, probably in the first place, and for this to come up. And I tend with that to fall on the side of the housing crisis is just immense, and we really need the housing. So I guess when I kind of try to think it through that way, I'm landing on the side of just leaving it the way we've got it.
Are there any other? Commissioner Fragala?
Yes, I'll just say that I agree that we're talking about a small percentage of lots. I also think that builders will be looking at what's attractive and we'll take those things into considerations. I don't think everything will be built out to 75%. And I appreciate the thinking, Commissioner Ramey. I think it's an important thing to be thinking about, particularly the tree canopy. But I'm comfortable with the 75% that we have for all of the middle housing types.
I guess I'd have a question maybe for Lauren. Should we take a motion and vote on this? Or are we kind of hearing the substance of direction here?
Thanks, Commissioner Reese. I think it's really up to you as the chair. What I heard was Commissioner Ramey proposing something other than the code that's been provided to you and kind of, well, you haven't straw-polled it yet, but other than the recommended code. And I heard 4 commissioners say that they were comfortable with the recommended code. So I don't think that staff has been given direction to make any changes to the code at this point.
Okay, why don't we just leave it at that? All right. Does anyone else is there any other comments?
Commissioner
Ramey, thank you.
So I'm going to channel former Commissioner Baker here, Steve Baker, and I want to let it be known that I'm in favor of light and air and livability. And my proposal does not in any way reduce my strong support for more housing. What it does is put a finer tune on that in a certain circumstance that I believe is necessary for what we're talking about when we do infill housing. So if it's 4-1, I'm fine with that. And I think we should have a vote because I want to be on the record where my feelings are recorded.
And if I could take the opportunity to also ask you to clarify, Commissioner Ramey, when you're talking about this, the lot coverage was proposed to increase for, as we said earlier, triplexes, fourplexes, and townhomes also. And you are, just so we don't have to do this through every one, you are thinking about this across the board, correct?
Not for townhouses.
Okay, so apply to duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes. Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Isaacson?
Yeah, do we have any data at all in terms of how many, we toss around kind of a vague idea of how many housing this would affect. Do we have any actual numbers and say it's going to do, we're looking at 500 units that are applicable under this. If we drop it down to 60%, we're going to take it from 500 to 400. So really the opportunity cost here is 100. Do we have any data to be able to support that? And I would also like to mention this. I also share Commissioner Ramey's focus for livability as well, but and that's a soft but there. You know, this is a quote that was used about some of the things we've been doing recently, that we were going to have continuous 5-story urban canyons was a quote that was used, but that was 9 years ago when Envision Eugene was being put in place. So there is the notion that we tend to focus on the hyperbole, we tend to focus on the extreme because it could be that way. But any walk down Eugene does not see continuous 5-story canyons anywhere. So I would caution with the notion of saying, okay, well, it could be that way, but with the whole host of other problems that exist in Eugene to build here in general, before you even get to what we're talking about, I don't see continuous canyons being in our future.
Any other comments? I think based on Commissioner Ramey's request, maybe we will take a vote.
Can I call for a point of order, please?
Please.
So I'd like clarification on how we are processing the conversation tonight. At our last meeting, we did stop and take straw polls throughout. Was it Jeff, was it your plan that we would do a housing type and then straw poll that housing type? Was it an entire section, the middle housing lot standards and design standards, and straw poll that? What was our plan for decision making?
Thanks for asking for that point of clarification, Commissioner Fagala. I was imagining that at the end of each housing type, we would take an opportunity to take a poll on whether or not everybody was okay with the proposal as set forth. However, in the instance when a specific change is recommended or brought forward, such as what Commissioner Ramey has put out there, I do think it would benefit staff to have clear direction on how to move forward. So in instances like this, when there is potential for a lack of clarity, we're absolutely okay with going with a straw poll on these.
May I offer a suggestion, Chair Beeson? So that Commissioner Ramey is not boxed into, if we were to go with staff's recommendation to do each section, if we don't pull the one piece that he's discussing, that'll force him to not support an entire section. And so one way we can look at that is to ask in a section, is there anything that somebody would care to pull to take a straw poll on? And then we just pull that piece, we do a straw poll on the rest of it, and then we do a straw poll on that piece. Okay.
I think that looks like we're getting thumbs up. I think we can do that. So if I'm following you, I think he's asking that this piece be pulled. So I guess the only question is, I mean, at this point, I think I'm kind of back where I started. I'm hearing Commissioner Ramey request to pull this piece and have us take a vote on it. And so what I'm going to do, I guess, is ask that we do that. And then we'll consider the duplex section when we get to the end of it. And we'll do the same thing with each other piece as we go. And then if there's any request to pull any piece of any subsequent section, we'll do that. Commissioner Taylor.
I just wanted to note for the record, since we're going to do this, is that I think it's definitely valuable to consider. We heard obviously a lot of public testimony about the need for housing, affordability, and there was a portion of the population that really obviously want livability. And I don't necessarily think that livability is we're gonna give up livability with the 75%. Yet I do recognize and think it's valuable. So while I am more in line with, I like the quote that Commissioner Isaacson brought up. I mean, that's kind of my experience. I do think it's something that I would like to encourage. You know, I feel comfortable with the 75%, yet I do think I'd love to put a little pin in this one for us to watch the evolution over time, because I think it's going to be important to identify and rectify if for some reason it becomes a bunch of canyons with no livability.
Okay, thanks. Commissioner Isaacson.
I didn't get it. I'm sorry, I didn't get a reply from staff on, do we have data? I mean, we've had another round of conversation and we've put a lot of conjecture into what we're talking about, but do we know? Because I would tell you, if Commissioner Ramey's proposal, we're talking about 20 units there at the city, I could probably have a conversation about lowering that down. If it's talking about moving from half the number of units, I'm a hard no on it. So, I mean, do we have any data to be able to say, you know, moving this from point A to B is going to generate C?
Commissioner Isaacson, if you're asking about lot sizes, since you suggested changing the standard at the 5,000 square foot size, yes, we have all of that data. It's on the lot size map that's in the guide to the adoption process and also separately on the website. And I'm looking at it. The published version cuts it off at 4,500 square feet, but the vast majority of residential lots are over 4,500 square feet. So there are 50,000 of them and change, and 4,000 and change that are under 4,500 square feet.
Okay.
Commissioner Ramey.
So I think we should just proceed with the straw poll on this item that I pulled out from the pile. And I would say that if possible, again, if the commission would agree to this, I will also be introducing a motion that's separate from all this, which urges the city council to put in place monitoring and a review of the whole program, including funding for that. And that if the council, if we agree, certain issues are examined during that process. And one of them could be, again, if Planning Commission agrees, coverage ratios and how that's playing out. That would be a win-win for, well, it's close I get to on the wrong end of 1-4 vote, but that would be a win-win for me.
Okay, thank you. I'm not seeing any more hands, so I think, Lauren?
Sorry, Commissioner Mason, just before we straw poll, could I ask Commissioner Ramey to one more time re-articulate the proposal so it's clear to everyone what the commission is voting on?
I was proposing that the coverage ratio change for lots above 5,000 square feet from the current draft proposal of 75% to the new coverage, which would be 60%, which would gently reduce the amount of buildable area available on larger lots, possibly not result in any fewer units, but I don't have data to support that. I can tell you how many square feet it reduces, but I can't tell you how that translates into units, and no one knows. But that's the proposal.
Okay, so we're going to take a straw poll. Lots larger on the lots for duplexes on the lots larger than 5,000 square feet, we'd go from 75% to 60%. On lots less than 5,000 square feet, we'd stay at the 75%.
Commissioner Mason, if I may, I understood Commissioner Ramey's proposal to apply to more than just duplexes. We're talking about.
Oh, just to save time. So we don't have to do this 3 times, just to save time.
Okay, so we'll do duplexes, triplexes, quads,
and then that's
cottage cluster.
No.
Okay.
Just,
so just those 3.
Fourplexes, yes.
All right. Okay, so I'll ask everyone who agrees with that to please raise your hand. And if you don't agree, please raise your hand. Thank you. I counted it at 5 to 1. Okay.
All right. So
Did you, Commissioner Beeson, did you put your hand down? I just want to, okay.
yes. All right. So with that, that was the
yes was the short answer. Sorry.
Looking at were there any other comments on the design standard section or the minimum off-street parking? If not, I will move on.
So if we were going to continue to use the decision-making process we discussed, we would want to take a straw poll on the rest of it? Or no? We're just gonna only straw poll on the things we pull?
It was my understanding that I would finish up the duplex standards,
Okay,
and then we will, then we can take a straw poll following that. And actually that's, well, this is my last slide on duplexes, so that's appropriate. The only other development standard that I wanted to bring up today was that, and actually my arrow is backwards here, so please ignore that, because what is currently proposed is that the open space requirement in the R2, R3, and R4 zones for middle housing is going from 20% to 10%. So for other multi-unit developments, it's 20%. Flip that arrow around, don't ignore my slide. It is 10% for middle housing. And with that, we are at the end of duplexes and an opportunity to take a poll on that.
Okay, so we're at the end of duplexes, and I think that with our process we've agreed on, we will take a straw poll on the entire section that Jeff just reviewed with us. I guess what I do is ask for, first I would ask, are there any comments or any discussion about that? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands. So I would ask everyone who, yes, remains in agreement with the code amendment proposals for the duplex section to please raise your hand. Okay, I get 6-0. Thanks. Go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you. All right, so now we are moving on to triplexes and fourplexes, and I have lumped these together because generally speaking, they have the same design standards for the most part, barring the minimum lot size and parking. And so I'll make sure to call those out explicitly. So starting with minimum lot size, Eugene's proposal includes allowing triplexes on lots that are 3,500 square feet.
Hey, Jeff,
and
you're not sharing your screen. Did you want to?
I did want to share my screen. Thank you. Okay. Now I'm on board. So we're looking at minimum lot sizes for triplexes is 3,500 square feet, whereas single unit dwellings are 4,500. And then for fourplexes, the lot size is 4,500 square feet, which is the same as single unit detached dwellings. And so that falls into the incentivized category because we also have lot size reductions. And I'll discuss those a little bit later in the presentation for everybody's benefit. Looking at minimum frontage, we're looking at the same. So we're in the same as single unit dwellings, so that's in the allowed category. And minimum lot width, we did reduce for interior and corner lots and cul-de-sac bulb lots to 35 feet. Whereas flag lots stayed the same at 50 feet. So it's a mix of allow and encourage. So with that, I will open it up for any questions. Seeing none, I will move on to the next section. Here we're looking at setbacks. So once again, both front yard and interior yard, we are in the allowed category. We are not changing the applicable setbacks from how they currently are now and how they apply to single unit dwellings. Lastly, maximum height, we are changing that from 30 feet up to 35 feet. So then that's in the encouraged category. Are there any questions on this one? Seeing none, I'll move on to parking. So here I've shown what we're proposing for triplexes on the top and what we're proposing for fourplexes on the bottom. So for triplexes, it's lots under 3,000 is one space, lots 3,000 to 5,000 or 4,999 is two spaces, and then 5,000 to 6,999 is three spaces. And that matches the minimum standards. Although we do offer some incentives for small units and reduced parking near transit, as well as some on-street parking benefits that also apply. And then for fourplexes, it's the same lot sizes. However, instead of one space, it's 2 for the smallest from 3 to 4,999, and 3 for 5,000 to 6,999, and then lots 7,000 feet or over, it's 4 spaces. And again, those same incentives apply. So Commissioner Ramey, I see your hands up.
Oh, thank you. So with this standard, I would like us to consider changing the incentive from a 0. So in other words, it seems like that's too much. If we're going from requiring 3 spaces for the triplexes to 0 spaces, that seems like more than is advisable. And so my proposal, and this is what I thought we were doing, I must have not tracked this to begin with. My proposal would be that we allow a reduction of 1 space if you're near transit. So if you're required to provide 1 space, you're required to provide 0. If you're required to provide 2 spaces, you're required to provide 1 space. And if you're required to provide 3, then you're required to provide 2 if you're near transit. So it's not going 0, it's sort of stepping it according to the number of units, which I think is going to be a little more closer to what we're actually going to end up with how people use these units. But that's my proposal, not go to 0, but to stair step the requirements by allowing a reduction of 1 space per lot size, or how that gets phrased.
Thanks, Commissioner Ramey. And Commissioner Edwards, if you don't mind if I interject really quickly, we do have a section about incentives later on. So it might be good to hold on this conversation until we get to that point. And right now we're really just looking at the base requirement, which would be matching for basically looking at the lot sizes and the number of spaces required, if that makes sense to everybody. And we can talk about the parking reductions kind of as a whole later on when we get to that section, if that's agreeable to Commissioner Ramey.
Well, just a point of order, I'm not here later on. I'm not here next Tuesday.
I'm hopeful that we can get to it today.
There's later and then there's later.
At the pace that we're moving, I think we will get to discuss that this evening. So, Commissioner Edwards.
My quick question just had to do with when we do get to that part of the discussion, I'm curious just about on-street parking mitigation. So if there is ample on-street parking, I mean, I don't, that we're not talking about that right now. And so I don't know if that is, if that is a factor that can be incorporated into that decision. So
absolutely,
I will put a pin in that because it's kind of comes with the incentive conversation. So
perfect. Are there any questions around the number of spaces that are required based on lot sizes and the allow option that we are matching the state minimum standard? All right, and then so I'm going to move on at this time. Looking at design standards. So we do actually have design standards that apply, special development standards that apply to triplexes and fourplexes and, and I will talk about those on the next slide. We call this the allow version because generally speaking, we pretty much have adopted the model code and drafted it into language that works a little bit better with the way that Eugene uses it, but primarily speaking, these are standards that we have co-opted into from the model code. So, and then lastly, looking at lot coverage, again, that was the conversation we had earlier around it's currently proposed at 75%. So knowing that we're about to go into a little more detail on the design standards, is everybody okay moving forward? Are there any questions? All right. So for the design standards specifically for triplexes and fourplexes, we have essentially 4 or 5 primary design standards. There's entry orientations. That's looking at the way that the front entrance of the house is oriented to the whatever frontage it has. It has window coverage requirements, has garage requirements, and then off-street parking area requirements and limitations. And then it has requirements for the actual driveway approach, which talks about the width of driveways and where they can be located relative to the property's frontage. And so I'd like to open it up for that first bullet if anybody has any questions or topics they'd like to discuss for design standards specifically. Commissioner Taylor.
When I wanted to just say thank you to staff. I know that from the model code, there actually has been some sifting through this. I guess my question that I wrote in here, and I basically asked a lot of why, where did this come from? I personally think that the design standards are to some degree for triplexes and fourplexes are a little inconsistent with the rest of the way we're approaching middle housing. It's a little onerous, and we don't have design standards throughout the city of Eugene. Generally, there are certain code sections in certain special areas that do have some. So I guess I can go into the detail, but I would like to see if other commissioners are interested. I would like to take a look at some of this detail and actually either eliminate, delete, or reduce some of the requirements so there's a little bit more flexibility.
So this might be a good opportunity for just to take a quick poll if there's interest from other planning commissioners to see if we want to, I can open the code and we kind of look at these a little more carefully and have discussions around the specific design standards and how they're written. I'll let Commissioner Edwards speak before we do that.
Sure. I will just say I'm super supportive of that because I think that our design standards have been designed around single unit homes. And I think that middle housing has different, you can't put a one size fits all approach that seems to work for everything. I would be really supportive of looking at some more flexibility in the design standards for middle housing. Absolutely.
Commissioner Beeson.
I'm supportive of it. I'm sitting here kind of thinking about process, and I'm thinking about the fact that we have a couple more meetings in front of us before we have to approve a recommendation. And it seems like I'm going to suggest that maybe Commissioner Taylor work directly with staff on what those edits would look like, and then or what those edits would be, and then get that sent back to us so we could see what the finished product looks like. It seems like we'd have to get there one way or the other to see what the edits would be, and either talk about them as a group or maybe see them. So I'm kind of thinking, I'm throwing that out as a suggestion, which would allow us to maybe be looking at what these suggested changes would be by our next meeting.
Thanks, Commissioner Taylor, or Commissioner Beeson. And just to let you know, we did meet with Commissioner Taylor and she did provide us with her notes. However, we did not call out specifically which items she would be interested in potentially working on at the Planning Commission level. So I'll let Commissioner Taylor respond.
So I actually gave them all of my markup suggestions. I only have 3 that I'm really bringing up. And this particular item was one of the ones that staff had, as we were working through, seemed like a viable discussion to have with the rest of the Planning Commission.
Well,
and I'm open. I think some of them, I don't have explicit, I just find them to be somewhat arbitrary and wanted to explore that with Planning Commission. I'm more than willing to come up with comments to bring back that's more, I have them, but more specific. But so I'm flexible, whatever works best.
Well, just briefly, since I'm supportive of it, just like Commissioner Edwards, and that if you've already got them, I think to the extent we could see them, and that's all I'd be looking for. I don't really need a lot of comments or anything, just what the edits would be as proposed.
So Commissioner Beeson, I actually really am very curious. It sounds like both you and Commissioner Edwards are interested. I guess I'm more interested to find out if others are. And if there isn't an interest, I can move on.
Commissioner Fragola.
I have an interest in of looking at it as long as the we would be in compliance with HB 2001. I'm noticing that this is the design standards. It's a big yellow allow line. So I'm wondering if we make changes if we won't be in compliance with the law. And then I do also want to recognize that Commissioner Ramey has identified that he wants an opportunity to talk about the small units incentives tonight. And so I want to make sure that we have the time to do that as well. So I would be supportive of bringing it back in the manner that Chair Beeson identified.
Commissioner Ramey.
I'm very supportive of taking advantage of Commissioner Taylor's expertise in this area. And that's always been a value added in the past. So totally would love to do this. If Commissioner Taylor, did I hear you say you had 3 items, or did I misunderstand what you meant by that?
Yeah, I only have 3 main items I'm going to bring. I had a lot. No, but
yeah.
Most of them are
and then
minor.
To Commissioner Fragala's point, they have to be less restrictive. They can't be more restrictive than the model code. So presumably
so that's the objective, right? The objective is it would be consistent with the model code because it's going to get less restrictive. That was what I was proposing.
Lauren.
Thanks, Commissioner Beeson. I think I'm not even sure I need to say this now because Commissioner Ramey and Commissioner Taylor just said it, but to Commissioner Fragala's question, for design standards, the design standards adopted by the city need to be either the same as the model code, less restrictive than the model code, or the same as design standards applied to single family development in the same zone. And Eugene generally does not have design standards for single family. So we are looking at same as the model code or less restrictive than the model code. So if you want to create flexibility or take away design standards, you have the authority to do that. Planning Commission does not, or we wouldn't have the authority to make things more restrictive. And then in terms of how the language comes back to the Planning Commission, you planning commissioners can decide if you want to take a little bit of time tonight to kind of talk about generally what you'd like to see in terms of changes to design standards, or Commissioner Taylor can make her suggestions. Either way, staff would bring back specific language changes for you to review and make a decision on at a subsequent meeting. We wouldn't expect you to do that tonight. So those are my 2 little pieces. Thanks.
Commissioner Isaacson.
I'm completely supportive of it, but to ring a bell that Commissioner Fragala rings quite often and appropriately, we are under a gun to get this both to the council and for them to approve it by the deadline. So as long as what we're doing and putting it into the schedule, even if it means additional meetings, we fit into that same time period, that we can still meet that obligation, that obviously is paramount.
Any other comments? I guess if we're done with triplexes and quads, I would suggest, let me try this, that we take a straw poll on the whole section, excluding the parking incentives, the part that Commissioner Ramey talked about, and under the understanding we're going to get to that in a few minutes. And with the understanding that these 3 edits on the design standards would come to us maybe next week, or come to us so that we can see them prior to next week. So I'm presuming we don't want to talk, we won't talk about them tonight, but given what I'm hearing from a couple of commissioners, and I agree, we'll try to stay on our track to get to get through the agenda of items tonight, including the parking incentives. So that's my proposal. We vote on the triplex and quad amendments with the two exclusions I mentioned. I'm not seeing any hands, so I'm going to assume that you agreed with that. So everybody in favor of that, of the code amendments as proposed right now for with the two exclusions for quads and triplexes, please raise your hand. Okay, 6-0. Thank you. So Jeff, we'll go ahead.
All right, moving on to townhouses. So we are looking at a minimum lot size of no minimum lot size. And this is essentially to allow the density provisions for townhomes to actually govern the overall lot size as well as the width standards. So providing a lot of flexibility in design by doing that. The next one is looking at minimum frontage. So we've proposed a minimum frontage of 15 feet, minimum lot width. Again, this is a situation where no minimum lot width, there is no minimum lot width requirement. 15 feet for frontage would govern. Then after that, it would be based on the feasibility for structures. So are there any questions about this first section? Seeing none. Move on to the next one. Looking at setbacks, again, remembering that townhomes don't have setbacks in between because they have zero lot line because they're attached to the structure next to them. But other than that, the setbacks are not changing. Are there any questions about setbacks? Seeing none. Maximum height, this is the same as in the other areas for other middle housing types. We're looking at going from 30 feet to 35, which would be encouraged. Minimum off-street parking is 1 space per dwelling. Knowing that we will talk later about those parking incentives that exist. And then design standards. This is one where there is design standards around entry orientation unit, features, windows, driveway access, and parking. And we'll get into those on the next slide. So is there any questions on the number of parking spaces required or height? Seeing none. Here I just have a reminder of what we looked at for maximum density. So we were looking at 25 units per acre in R1, 39 in R2, and after that it would just be feasibility in the R3 and R4. Design standards, we have entry orientation windows, unit features, so that's requiring, there's a list of kind of like bay windows, porches, etc. that there's a certain number that you need to meet, and design features that you have to add. Garages and off-street parking areas and driveway approaches are all part of the design standards. And then again, going from open space requirements in the R2, 3, and R4 from 20 to 10%. Oh, I got it right there. So are there any questions, conversations that want to happen around these sections for townhouses? Commissioner Taylor.
I have the same question about townhouses. It's actually not that complicated. So I think I can follow up and next time provide very explicit kind of feedback to Planning Commission. I was more open-ended, but to jumpstart the communication, I can do that.
All right, are there any other, so knowing that we will get a follow-up of recommendations for related to design standards, and Commissioner Taylor will work with staff on that. And any other questions? All right, do we want to take a poll as to whether there are any other items besides those that Commissioner Taylor will bring back to us, and those parking incentives that we'll discuss later? Anything else for townhouses? Does everybody agree on moving forward with the draft code as proposed? See, yeah, you can raise your hands. Perfect. All right, and before it's 6:45. You've heard a lot of me talking and you've done a lot of hand raising. So I think before we jump into cottage clusters, it might be a good opportunity to take a 5-minute break, and we can return. Oh, it's 6:46 now. So we can return at 6:51. If Chair Beeson, do you think that's a good idea?
Good idea.
Thumbs up. All right, so we will return in 5 minutes. start back up with cottage clusters. Cottage clusters currently proposed to be on lots that are 4,500 square feet. And then so that's in the encouraged category. It's the same as single unit dwellings, and it's less than what's the 7,000 square feet that's in the model code. And then we also do have incentives built in for small units. And again, we'll have an opportunity to talk about those a little bit later too. So minimum frontage, again, we went with allow here where we have the exact same frontage that's required for a single unit dwelling. So are there any questions around the standards for minimum lot size or frontage? Seeing none, keep it moving. Minimum lot width, we again kept it the same as single unit dwellings, and then the same can be said for front yard setbacks and interior yard setbacks. So are there any questions about lot width or setbacks as proposed? Seeing none. Maximum heights, the maximum height for cottage clusters is 25 feet. This is the same as the model code. And you do see that there's a clarification in the model code. It does say 25 feet or 2 stories, whichever is greater, whereas ours is capped simply at the 25 feet. So that is in the allow category. We have off-street parking. Again, this is 1 space per dwelling with some of those parking incentives that we'll talk about in a little bit. And there are a number of design standards for the cottage clusters. We'll get to those on the next slide. So are there any questions about the maximum height of 25 feet or the required off-street parking? Commissioner Edwards.
I just have a question. What would 2 stories be as far as feet?
Typically, 2 stories, anything 20 feet or higher easily allows 2 stories. You recently saw with the ADU code amendments where we went through the process of kind of investigating what the best option was to create that flexibility. And the testimony that came in through that project really illustrated that 25 feet was okay for a 2-story structure. A lot of space for the crawl space, structure, attic.
Oh, thank you.
Commissioner Taylor.
I know we don't do this in other parts of the code. Actually, we have them in some of the special area zones. I do honestly like or 2 stories, whichever is greater, just to allow some flexibility for the design. Because then it's design centered in terms of whatever amenities, detailing, rather than targeting that 25 feet. Just because, you know, single family has an allowance of 30 feet. I always think of it relevant to that single house and what the objective or purpose of House Bill 2001. So I guess I haven't thought about it as much. I'm flexible, but I kind of like the model code's approach. So I guess I would propose that as for consideration to Planning Commission.
Chair Beeson.
I would support that. I like that better too. And I'm thinking we'd probably, if we all agreed on that, are you also suggesting we'd go through and look at a few other spots where it would apply, or just this spot?
I think I saw Commissioner Taylor nod, so I think she was saying that it would just be for cottage clusters that she was looking at that potential. One clarification I would ask is that actually I don't think I need clarification now that I think about that. If there's clear direction or clear interest in this, I do think that we should poll to make sure that there's interest from all commissioners to direct staff to make that change and ensure that it's consistent with what's allowed through the minimum standards in the model code.
Commissioner Fragler, yeah.
So if we have 25 feet or 2 stories, whichever is greater, does that mean if the 2 stories is 30 feet, that they can approach 30 feet? Or,
That's correct.
okay, what if 2 stories is 35 feet?
Based on the way that the model code's drafted, I don't think there's necessarily a limit. I think it's more of a construction feasibility limit. Right? So there is no height limit as I read it here. Lauren can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my understanding with the model code.
I know that I have an answer, but I had that same question, Commissioner Fragala, and so that's certainly something that Jeff and I can look into before bringing proposed language back to you. Another possibility could be, 2 stories but not to exceed 30 feet, so that the height limit would not exceed the height limit for a single family home. We can think about it in different ways.
Commissioner Edwards.
That was just going to be my suggestion, that we just put a max on it, and I like the 30 feet, which is what single family home. So Lauren stole my thunder, so nice work.
I think part of the Jeff, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think part of the construction feasibility consideration with a cottage cluster is that the footprint is limited and the overall square footage is limited. So I don't know how realistic it is to think that you would have a very tall 2-story cottage on a very small footprint, but regardless,
houses.
we could, limit that height, to put a hard cap on the height, just to make sure that it doesn't exceed 30 feet.
So based on my understanding, there's interest from the Planning Commission in looking at a maximum height of 30 feet and a maximum of 2 stories. Is that, if that's, please correct me if I'm wrong, but otherwise I think we can probably take a straw poll to give staff direction to go make those changes and come back to you if there's any issues. And so with that, I will ask, does everybody agree that to changing the maximum height to 25 feet or to 30 feet or 2 stories? Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Great, thank you. And then were there any questions on the 1 space per dwelling for parking? Nope. All right. So you can ignore the maximum density section up here. That was an incorrect holdover from me. I apologize in my haste, I copied that over. So looking at the design standards, that's for townhouses. Looking at design standards, the cottage clusters have the most design standards out of any of the unit types. And these design standards came directly from the model code and just were slightly altered to ensure that they mix with Eugene's code pretty well. So we've got cottage orientation, courtyard design standards, community building standards, pedestrian access, windows, parking, screening, garbage or garages and carports, accessory structures, and existing structures. And so I do want to open it up for those design standards if there's any questions. There's a lot of them, and if there's interest in changing those. And Commissioner Taylor, I see your hand is raised. And you're muted.
You have my notes. This one, I recognize that there's a lot more design standard that's being handed down from the legislature. So really my area, which I don't know just because of the other 2 areas, if you just want to throw it into the mix, Jeff, rather than focus on it tonight. Okay.
So yeah, staff can work to bring back Commissioner Taylor's recommended changes, and we can present on that on a later date for consideration on which design standards for triplexes, fourplexes, townhomes, and cottage clusters to ensure that her changes are before the commission in a clear way, and to leave room for discussion around the other things tonight. Once again, I apologize for the 10%, 20% mix up here. we're looking at an open space requirement in R2, R3, and R4 of 10%. And we will talk about tree preservation standards in a little bit. So with that, on cottage clusters, barring the changes to the maximum height that staff will bring back to you, that we have clear direction from the Planning Commission on, and the changes that staff will present for Commissioner Taylor and her changes to the design standards, does the commission agree to draft as currently proposed and moving on to the next section of deliberations? I'll let you raise your hands. Excellent. All right, so looking at lot standards. So these are looking at section 9.2760 and 2761. And these are looking at specifically at changes to the table as well as lot area reductions for when you're both creating lots and what's allowed on lots. So here, I just called out a few of the primary changes. Most of these, I should say, these changes were made in order to align the lot standards with the allowed lot sizes for duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, cottage clusters, etc. And so most of the changes are just to ensure that the development standards and the lot standards match up. We do have item number 7 from the staff recommended changes, which you'll recall, where we were working to figure out the best way for the table to actually function. Staff is still working on the best solution for that, and we'll be presenting that to you at a later date. That's a functionality question, not necessarily a actual standards question. So we're going to work on that and present that to you at a later time. The one thing I will call out here is that flag lots for middle housing, we did make the change that the minimum lot area is 4,500 instead of 6,000 square feet. So we reduced that. And then the other one is that there are lot reductions for small middle housing units. So both of those incentives kind of exist for middle housing lots. So Commissioner Taylor, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, I just want to bring up, I don't think it's here tonight, but we are going to talk about alley access and alley lots, right?
Correct. Yeah, staff has not finished preparing the materials for that. So we're going to be bringing that to you at the later deliberations. Any other questions about the lot standards, flag lots, lot area reductions? All right. I'm going to look at site development standards. So this is what staff refers to as the 9.6 thousands. These are those development standards that apply to all new development in Eugene as required through the applicability. And what you'll notice is that only really there are 4 things that changed in the development standards. And those are driveway and internal circulation, garbage and recycling screening, underground utilities, tree preservation and removal. For driveway and internal circulation, it was mostly just carving out, making sure that middle housing was treated in a way that's consistent with the requirements of HB 2001. And so those changes are relatively minor. The garbage and recycling screening, those changes were essentially to ensure that middle housing does not have the garbage and recycling screening requirements that apply to, at this point, they would only apply to multi-unit housing. So they don't apply to single family homes. Under this proposal, they won't apply to middle housing or ADUs. And then we did also make changes to underground utilities to ensure that if you're directly next to an existing above ground utility connection, that you can do infill development without having to underground your utilities. That's something that was supported by staff, and we went through those discussions back, I believe, in June. And then the last one, tree preservation and removal, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail. Are there any questions on the driveway, the first 3, so driveways, garbage, or the utilities? Commissioner Fagla.
Can you just maybe define or clarify what it means to be near an above ground utility? I mean, often the cable comes from the line to the house. does it just need to be within a certain distance to the property line?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way that we drafted this section is actually to not put a distance on it necessarily. Instead, what it says is that they can be served from an existing above ground utility owned structure without required addition of above ground utility owned structure. So if it doesn't require the addition of a new pole, you can connect to that existing pole or other above ground structure.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions? Commissioner Taylor? You're muted, I'm sorry. You're muted, Commissioner Taylor.
Sorry, thank you. I just want to make sure, which I think we are, we will return to the discussion in the 9.6s that have to do with the motor vehicle parking calculations required for certain areas that aren't special zones, but they have standard. We are going to do that at a different time.
That's correct. Staff will be bringing, so that's a reference to the university area neighborhoods that have special standards regarding parking. Yeah, we'll be bringing any changes related to those neighborhoods at a later date. So with that, are there any other questions? Otherwise, I will talk briefly about tree preservation and removal. We really wanted to make sure that this is well understood because it is something that we do see a lot of comments on within the testimony that we've been receiving. And what staff has currently drafted is essentially making middle housing affected by the tree preservation and removal standards the same way that a single unit dwelling or a duplex or an accessory dwelling currently is. And so it's essentially expanding that to incorporate triplexes, fourplexes, cottage clusters, and townhomes. And what that does is essentially it exempts them from, for lots that are under 20,000 square feet, it allows the removal of significant trees from a parcel without triggering the actual tree preservation standards that exist within this portion of the code. Lots that are over 20,000 square feet or larger, you can remove up to 5 trees within 12 consecutive months. And I will also call attention to the fact that these are not changes that are being made to Chapter 6, which have their own tree permit and removal standards that do exist. So this is simply a change to the Chapter 9 tree preservation standards, and that's something that I wanted to call attention to. So are there any questions around the tree preservation and removal standards and the way that we're changing them? Okay. With that, I will move on to parking reductions. We made it. So we are offering parking reductions in a couple of different ways. So the first is that there is no off-street parking required, and I think this is what Commissioner Ramey was getting at, for middle housing that is within the buffer of a frequent transit route. And so that's the figure that on November 30th, you agreed to option number 3. It shows kind of which tax lots are incorporated into the buffer of the frequent transit routes. And those have no parking requirement. The other incentive that exists, or parking reduction incentive, is that on-street parking credits may contribute to minimum middle housing off-street parking requirements. And there are some caveats to that. Things like it has to be a street that meets the minimum width, it has to be paved, and it has to be under the ownership of the city of Eugene. It can't be like a local access road that's under county jurisdiction, for example. And then the other important thing to think about in this one is that when you're looking at on-street parking credits, there's a size determination for how big the area has to be abutting the lot with a parking space. And it's written very specifically so that if you have a parking space that touches 2 different properties that are both developed with middle housing, both of those properties can claim that on-street parking space to count towards their minimum. So essentially it's saying that one on-street parking space could count towards both properties if it's touching those 2. And then the last one is a parking reduction related to dwellings that are less than 900 square feet. So each middle housing unit that is less than 900 square feet on a lot, that does not have a parking requirement. If there's another, so if you've got a fourplex and two of the units are below 900 square feet and the other two are above that, you will still have a parking requirement for those two units that are above 900 square feet. And so with that, I'll open it up for questions. Commissioner Edwards.
I have a question before we dig into the more substantive part of this conversation, but does the city have any requirements for people to actually park in their off-street parking? I'm asking because what I've witnessed over the pandemic is a whole lot of two-car garages that nobody's parking in because they're using them for storage or workout rooms or whatever they're doing. So I'm just kind of wondering if there's anything that if the city has any way to regulate whether or not people are using a garage or some sort of off-street parking space for the actual parking.
The city regulates on-street parking, as you know, and then it has the requirement that there is off-street parking provided. It does not require a person to park in their off-street parking spaces. So
makes sense.
They're required there, but we can't force them to park there.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Taylor.
You know, this topic came up in one of the committees that I was on, boards and commissions. I can't remember the name of my group, but this is an interest in, and public testimony has also brought this up. While I support this, there's also the flip side in terms of equity. So I think Commissioner Edwards brought this up. Like if there's no off-street part, there can be equity issues. For instance, if there is a developer that built a development with dwelling size less than 900 square feet, but it wasn't adjacent to a street with available on-street parking. Now you've got affordable housing, but you know, a single parent comes home with groceries, has their kids, has to walk a quarter of a mile to get to their unit. It is affordable. It's great. It was great, available, affordable housing for them, but now they don't have parking. So parking is always, I find, becomes quite complicated. So this has got another side to it. So I actually, while I support this because it makes sense when there's availability, like the first and second one, I guess with the second one, I would say I would want to know that this isn't an isolated site or a place where there's no allowed on-street parking, and you've got these residents needing now to walk.
Are there any other comments or response to Commissioner Taylor's thought? Commissioner Ramey.
Well, we find ourselves with the dilemma of only having two things that we can use to incentivize small units. What we boiled it down to is the size of the lot and parking. Those are the only tools we have in front of us, and frankly, they're imperfect tools for what we're trying to do. And Commissioner Taylor properly points out the problem, the dilemma that I have myself wrestled with is that these may be counterproductive. You create a unit that's smaller because you're trying to create a diversity of unit sizes. We don't think the market's going to create 900 square foot units, so we're trying to incentivize the market. But yet, if we don't allow people to park in front of it, then maybe it's not useful to people. So I don't know, Jeff, if there's a way to further complicate this by saying, you know, you only get the reduction if you can have if you're close to a street that has on-street parking. This issue is different for me than the transit issue, which is if we're close to the transit corridors, I think a reduction of one space rather than a wholesale all the spaces. That way we're incentivizing units near transit, and the two things are working together because the users of those units have access to transit. So these are two different issues for me, those that are near transit and those that we're trying to create as small units by incentivizing using parking.
Commissioner Beeson.
Yeah, I think I'd like to speak to both quickly. I guess the one that's on the screen is the, off street, the unit size less than 900 square feet, and that's anywhere in the city. And the other one I think had to do with, if I understood it right, that Commissioner Ramey was initially bringing up, had to do maybe with the, within the buffer zone where we were going to 0. Assuming I've got that right, I think this is a really hard issue. And maybe that goes without saying, but it's been brought up, it's been discussed quite a bit, and I know I can really see both sides of it. I find myself though wanting to advocate that we stay with the way we've drafted the code at this point. And that's given it's still got to go through additional public process and a council review, and it's going to get a lot more discussion. But we know that, I guess I kind of have just a couple of quick points. The developer, in all these cases, there's nothing that precludes a developer from providing the parking. I think it's also important to say, and I don't have data on it, I wish I did, but not all people drive, not all people own cars. So when we talk about dilemmas for people who have cars and maybe have to park a lot or two away, I concur with that. That is a dilemma. But it's also maybe a dilemma or a bit of an issue. If you don't drive, the way I see this kind of unfolding is that there is additional opportunity for people to be able to rent units where they're not having to pay for parking embedded in the rent, and it creates more affordable housing. So, I guess those are kind of my points, and I think I'm really focused, I guess, on the buffer areas with the frequent transit, the understood frequent transits nearby. But I think by doing this, taking this step as middle housing is implemented in the city, taking this step and kind of watching it, I really agree with the review process over time. But I think the idea of being able to offer the option for housing to be developed that doesn't have the parking and is more affordable, I think would be a good one.
Commissioner Taylor.
Thank you. Commissioner Beeson, yeah, I agree with you in terms of the cars. So, and what I'd like to do is make a suggestion. And really, I am comfortable with bullet point 1 and 2 because essentially it's kind of addressing the multi-mode and kind of access. My issue really is with 3, and that doesn't even address transit. So we do have a clause in the code that's used very frequently within a quarter mile. So it can be within a quarter mile of on-street parking, a quarter mile of transit, I really want there to be choice for these very small units, that if it's developed by someone else, and that is an awesome opportunity for someone to have a very affordable unit, and if access is really difficult to get there, I think there is some equity issues embedded in it, potentially. So I think the motivation should be, yes, do it, but do it thoughtfully. And that means provide it in enough proximity so there's access to transportation of some kind.
Thanks, Commissioner Taylor. Commissioner Edwards, and then we have Terry.
Sorry, just trying to unmute. I apologize. This is a complicated issue for me because I echo what Commissioner Beeson mentioned, which is really that, not imposing parking requirements does not mean that there won't be parking. It just, it just ensures that the code is not what's going to drive how, a site is developed. And I think because I'm not a builder, I don't really know how what they use to factor that in, but I know that it's pretty thoughtful. And I know that even if you remove parking requirements, it wouldn't mean people would just say, yay, we don't have to provide parking. I do think that, I think that they factor in a lot of different things. So I struggle with this one though, because I don't like the mandate of just assuming that there's a one size fits all kind of approach. And I like the idea of not requiring something that really is kind of site specific, location specific. I mean, there could be completely empty streets that have plenty of on-street parking where it's just not necessary. And it really helps, for units to be brought in at a lot lower cost, or a price point for somebody. And I just don't think that we can blanket say across the city that there's this one approach when it's not always going to be needed. So I guess I struggle with this one because I do have faith that the people building middle housing are going to be thoughtful about all of those things, and aren't going to build something that nobody will rent or buy because they can't park a vehicle, if that's really necessary where that specific site is. So anyhow, I'm torn.
Terry.
Thanks, Jeff. I just wanted to mention briefly, because it's very on topic, the state rulemaking that's going on for climate-friendly and equitable communities. So the way that state rulemaking is going, parking reform is a big part of the rules that are currently being finalized and vetted through a rulemaking committee. And the easiest path to complying with the rules is to just eliminate parking requirements across the city. And so those are not adopted yet, but it's clear to me in being in some of those conversations that that's the direction that the rules are headed. And so just for what it's worth, that will come to you because we will be required to make code amendments, zone changes, and comprehensive plan amendments to implement those rules over the next couple of years. And so that's in the background in my mind as we're discussing this.
Okay, Commissioner Rainey.
Well, that's great news about the state. We don't know exactly what they're going to do, but that would certainly make this question a lot easier for us to answer if we did know. My point here was about the transit-oriented parking. I'm okay with the other. I have, my worries about it, but I'm okay with leaving the other 2 points. It's the first point where it seemed like going from 3 required spaces to 0 required spaces or 4 to 0 was maybe a bit much, and that we could find an in-between solution there, which seemed a little more realistic to me than just going to 0. But that's just, I'm looking at the landscape for the next 10 years. After that, it may be 0 everywhere, which then it won't matter. And certainly, yes, the market will drive the number of spaces, even in parking exempt zones. Developers are still building parking because they know that's what their clients and their predicted users are going to need. And I speak to you with some experience. I spent 30 years building the most efficient transportation system of any college campus. And while it seems like it doesn't work to us here in Eugene sometimes, when we look at standards across the country, it was a trendsetter, and it still is. So I have some experience with transportation demand management. And my inclination at this point is not to go to 0, but to go to some stair stepping in between, which is still a great incentive. It still ties development to transportation policy in a way that really has an effect on what people are going to do. And I think it sends a clear message that that's still very important to us. But we also realize it's a complicated issue. So we haven't gone all in. We've gone make a big enough gesture that it makes sense.
Commissioner Taylor.
Thanks, Terry. I just wanted to let you all know in light of what Terry, your further explanation, and obviously there's probably a lot of participation that I can support, and I'm comfortable with these 3 bullets.
So, Commissioner Ramey, based on your comments, do you have a specific recommendation you'd like to put forward, or any sort of request you would like to make that we can
Yeah, so it was where I started with the duplex, the triplex in the guide, where it talks about the 3 different levels of lots and the 3 different levels of parking required. I would just say you reduce each of those level by 1 if you're in a transit corridor. So it's an incentive, but it still provides some parking, but not all of the parking. And it's way the rest of the code works. If you have a transportation demand management plan, you're allowed to reduce the parking that you supply in your development. So it's similar. You don't get to go to 0, but you get to reduce it by some fraction. It's like 25%, I think.
And that's a perfect lead in for my next question, because talking about a single parking space reduction for triplexes and fourplexes makes sense, but I did have the question for how it applies to townhomes and cottage clusters, where the number of units isn't static. It can be dynamic. So it's like, do we want to look at a percentage? Would you be interested in a percentage change as opposed to a single space change? And that would be, you could say 25%, and that would, under our current parking regulations, you then round down. And so that would reduce to 1 parking space reduction for triplexes and quadplexes. And then in the other cottage clusters and townhomes, it would just reduce it by a certain number based on the size of the development. So am I capturing kind of what you're thinking?
Yeah. I'm not sure if all the math, it seems like 25% would only kick in if you had 4 units. So you'd only qualify for a reduction if you had 4 units.
It's if you have a fraction of a required parking space, you just round down to the nearest parking space. So for a triplex, it would bring you down to 2.
Okay, so essentially what I'm talking about.
Precisely, yeah. It's just
that's a lot. That just makes the math so much easier. Just say, well, yeah, what you said. Okay. Yeah, that, and again, I think that parallels other places in the code.
Okay, so with that, I would ask, and Commissioner, please correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm getting this incorrect, but poll whether or not they're changing the current proposal from no off-street parking requirement within the frequent transit route buffers to a 25% reduction in parking requirements if you're within the frequent transit route buffers. Did I get that correct?
Yes, and I think the same, if someone wanted to say 50%, I'd support that as well.
Commissioner Feigeler.
So we're talking just about within the transit zone that we identified last time, correct?
That's correct.
We're no longer talking about the less than 900 square feet.
No, we're only talking about those properties that are within the buffer of the frequent transit route corridors.
Okay, and so could you maybe break it down for me in terms of if, like, we have a fourplex, and what the original proposal was if they're within a quarter mile of transportation, or I believe it was a half a mile of the MX, then for a fourplex, as it's currently written, all 4 of those buildings could not have a parking space. But if we make the change that's being suggested, then let's say we went with 50%. If we made the change to 50%, we're still talking about buildings within a quarter mile of transportation that would, the incentive would apply only if, so then 2 would have parking and 2 would not. As far as a code definition, not applying to what developers could choose or could choose not to do. Am I understanding that correctly?
That is a correct understanding. Yes.
So again, we're only talking about that development within the quarter mile of the transit or within the half a mile of the MX. So we're talking about development that for the most part is also targeted for multifamily housing or multi-dwelling housing. And we're also talking about lots that could potentially be developed for middle housing that are within a walkable distance to a transit route. Yes.
Correct.
Okay. So I guess for me, you know, we're talking about a very specific subset of lots that could potentially be developed and could potentially, if the developer so chose, to not include housing. And again, I think that's a subgroup of a subgroup of a subgroup, and they're within walking distance. We have of a transportation route, and we have data that people are willing to walk that distance. And I will say that I also personally heard and saw submitted testimony that community members are encouraging us, and I believe it's because of the same climate action and sustainability goals that Terry just pointed out, that we do consider these parking incentives and not adopting parking requirements. So I appreciate the nuance to the conversation, but I think I'm going to support the code as it's originally written, based on what I've heard in public testimony and based on the data that we have about how far people are willing to walk.
Thank you, Commissioner Fragala. So based on Commissioner Raby, I want to.
Well, just as a follow-up, it's my experience is people are going to find alternative modes for transportation, but not everyone is going to do that. And so it's always important to provide options across the whole range. And my worry was that the option we were picking didn't allow people to have cars to actually use them. And so if there was some way we could get to some middle ground there, that was my incentive, is it's not 100% of people are going to choose alternative modes. It's a fraction of the population. And what we're trying to do is be sure that the fraction that's not going to make that choice still has a choice. That's why zero caught my mind. It's like, well, zero is that's not right.
So I think at this point in the conversation, it's probably good to take a poll on where people stand. And so I think I'm actually going to phrase it a little bit differently than I was originally putting it. And I think I'll just ask the commissioners whether they want to keep the code as proposed for the reduction of 100% removal of parking requirements when you're within that frequent transit route corridor. And if you do support that, then you raise your hand. If there's a majority that does not support that, then we can talk about percentages and reductions and stuff like that. So my question to the Planning Commission then for this poll is, do you support and agree with the code as proposed for 100% reduction in parking within the frequent transit route corridors? I see 4 hands, and then those who would like to disagree with that statement and want to look into a percent reduction. Okay, so that's a 2 to 4 vote. So at this time, we'll keep the code as proposed. Commissioner Rainey.
But I'm hoping we can keep this pinned up for a suggestion to the council about an area of our changes that they monitor as we go forward.
Of course. I'll make a note on that. Thank you. All right, so let me continue sharing here. So the next one is looking at the actual small unit incentives with, oh, sorry, Lauren, please.
So if I just realized for myself that I don't think the commission took sort of overall straw polls on the lot standards, the 9.6 thousand design standards, and the parking reductions, other than Commissioner Ramey's proposal. So to kind of continue with the procedural posture that the council adopted, I would suggest that we go back and do that just to make it clear.
Thank you. That's a great recommendation. So I guess I'll take that poll for the site development standards, the 9.6 thousands regarding the driveway, garbage, underground utilities, and tree preservation. For those planning commissioners that support the code as proposed and would like to keep it the way it is. So 1, 2. All right. And lot creations standards. Again, this is one where we're going to be bringing you back some information about the actual lot standards table and its organization. But regarding the flag lot size, the lot reduction for small housing units, and the alignment with the allowed lot sizes for duplexes, is there planning commission support for these code provisions as shown, barring the organization of the table? I've got 5, and Commissioner Isaacson, your camera is off. Feel free to raise your virtual hand if that works for you as well. Oh, there it is. All right. And then for the other 2 parking reductions, I'll just ask if there's support for those code proposals as they currently stand. And that's specifically, sorry, I see 6 hands, and that's for the parking credit, on-street parking credits, and the no off-street parking for houses less than 900 square feet. Yeah, it's definitely getting towards 8 o'clock. Small unit incentives. So thank you, Lauren, for that. So really quickly, we've got small unit incentives for a lot area reduction of 25% for duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and cottage clusters. Townhouses are excluded because they're not regulated that way. So what we did was we added a density bonus for townhomes of 5 unit density bonus if you have units that are below 900 square feet or less. And then as we just discussed at length, the no off-street parking requirement for each unit that is 900 square feet. So are there any questions or deliberations on the reductions that are associated with small units? All right, so seeing none, do I have the planning commission support for the code as currently proposed regarding small units? Great. Other questions or topics? We have 20 minutes left. Are there, and I just want to, and this is a good opportunity, I should specify, if the planning commission has any specific topics that you have come across through your review of code or the testimony that you would like staff to bring forward, this would be a good opportunity to raise those topics or any other conversations that you think would be pertinent tonight.
I know we had a very long conversation about whether or not to have Commissioner Taylor forward us those changes because we were concerned about time, but now we find ourselves with 20 minutes of time. And I'm just wondering if we might not get through 1 or 2 of them at this point.
I personally, as staff, fully support that. I think it's a great idea. If the rest of the planning commission is nodding their heads and giving thumbs up, then I will return to Commissioner Taylor, if you'll please flip back to your notes. We will return back to the, let me get back to that. We'll start with the triplexes and fourplexes, the design standards. And I will share my screen again. And so this was specifically, there's 5 sections. There's entry, orientation, windows, garages, and off-street parking areas. and driveway approaches. I think the best thing for me to do at this point would be to ask Commissioner Taylor for her 3 recommendations, and I can go to that section of the code and share that with the commission. We can talk explicitly about those sections, because I'm pretty sure these ones are pretty pointed and easy to talk about.
Sounds good.
All right, so we are in the standards for, and please let me know if this is too small. I can zoom in a little bit. We're in the standards for triplexes and fourplexes. And so Commissioner Taylor, if you would please take us through your first item.
You're at subsection 4. I didn't see any clarified. I didn't see any. I'm fine with garages and off-street parking areas. Obviously, you can actually park in your driveway, so that I clarified. And that looks like there's no issues. So correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, so I didn't see any issues. Really where I was flagging kind of, if you go back to House Bill 2001 and the objective around it, we're providing quite a bit of design criteria here, when really the objective is to encourage housing. It wants to, we're taking an approach in a lot of other areas in our review that we're maintaining consistency with single family homes. So I am open to some design standards. I think we're just getting a little bit, it's getting a little detailed considering that context. So, I mean, other people, please bring it up, but where I saw, where my flags went up was entry orientation, for instance. It starts to get into a heavy level of detail, what the size of the porch is going to be. So quite frankly, I would eliminate B. It's basically saying you already have at least one main entry for each triplex or fourplex. Must meet a B or C. Any detached structure where more than 50% of the street is separated from the street property line, but a dwelling is exempt from meeting these standards. So it's saying, yes, you have to have one, but why does it have to be 8 feet of the longest street? I mean, it's just a level of detail that I think we're starting, I would delete it. So that's kind of the approach I took. Okay, we've got a main entry. We've got these larger buildings that have more of a mass at the frontage. They've got this interface with the public. Let's not get in and micromanage the design. Subsection C, face the street, be located at a 45-degree angle, open onto a porch. Why does it have to be 25 feet? Once again, I would eliminate that. I would just give these must either 1, 2, or 3, and let's not micromanage what the subsections of an open porch look like. So that would be the other thing I would do. So you're kind of getting a sense of where I was going with this. I think it's fine to have some level because of the massing, and I'm actually open to even less. So I guess really from my perspective, I don't like arbitrariness, so that's why I didn't want to come in with a strong feeling of this exactly. So if I'm going to say it clearly in terms of the strength, is I'd like to eliminate some of the micro regulation, which is the subsection. Subsection, the 1B above, I'd eliminate that. Under subsection C3, I'd eliminate A and B.
Okay, I think this is a good stopping point to have some discussion. I see Commissioner Edwards has her hand raised. So Commissioner Edwards, you have some comments on this?
Thanks, Jeff. I agree wholeheartedly with Commissioner Taylor's assessment. But I struggle because I don't have anything to replace this language with. I just think it's far too prescriptive to allow for any flexibility at all. And I agree. And the feedback that we've seen even in the record is the fact that the entry orientation for, entry orientation. Why does it all have to be the same direction facing the street? So I struggle because I agree, but I don't, short of just taking it all out, I don't know what it should be replaced with. I don't know what else we put in there, because to me, it just seems like a whole lot of really prescriptive, specific things, which, to be perfectly honest, I don't know why we need to have it for single family homes, but that's my opinion, but I know that's not what we're talking about. So I wish I had something better to offer, other than the fact that I just feel like it's just too much restriction for what we're trying to do here. So
Thanks,
that's
Commissioner.
yeah.
I'll add just some clarity about how this works, just because I live in this, so I'm happy to just walk through it really quick. So this does only require that one entrance of the triplex or fourplex has to meet these standards. So the other entrances can be facing a different direction. And so you kind of see that within basically saying that only one entrance has to meet B or C. And so the 8 foot on the longest street facing wall of the dwelling unit, that's basically just trying to control, and I'm just explaining, I just want to make sure everybody understands. That's controlling how far the actual entrance is from the street. And then the second one is just governing I should say the second one, C, is just governing the true design of the entryway and the porch and things like that. So I'm going to open it up for the rest of the commissioners to comment. I just wanted to make sure that was understood. So Commissioner Beeson.
Yeah, I guess I'm generally agreeing with Commissioner Edwards, and I'm going to, I take some risk here that there are sections of the code that at this point I probably should know a bit more about. It's a very quick question. We don't have design standards for single detached dwellings in Eugene, right?
That is correct.
Okay. So and when I do sort of general reading about this and the whole idea of kind of holding on to this major theme of the need for affordable housing, and we need it yesterday. I find myself, the idea of even having design standards sort of raises a question for me. And we don't need to go into a lot of detail. I don't need to, I guess, hear about it, but I would be in favor, I guess, of editing this as much as people are comfortable, distilling it down to whatever it is we think we need to have in Eugene going forward with middle housing. If we're not today requiring anything like this for single family dwellings, to me, all we're really doing, I guess I appreciate the aesthetics. I want to be a little careful here, but we're really adding, one thing we're doing is adding time and adding cost to development of the housing. So I'm generally in favor of trying to cut this down quite a bit.
Thanks, Commissioner Beeson. I want to make room for Lauren to correct me if I said something wrong.
No, thanks, Jeff. Just in case it's helpful to the commission, I just wanted to provide a little bit of background that most of these design standards, as we've discussed before, come directly from the model code. And the model code was developed to apply throughout the state. And different cities regulate housing design very differently than Eugene. So it may well be that Planning Commission says some of these design standards don't make sense for Eugene, and you could make that recommendation. And as a reminder, you can be same as model code or less restrictive than model code when it comes to these design standards. So Commissioner Edwards, when you're talking about replacing the design standards, I will say that Jeff and I had some of those conversations when we were going through the initial draft of the code, and we found it difficult to come up with alternate design standards that were not less restrictive than the model code and were still clear and objective. And so it's not to say that that's impossible, but that is something that we did put some thought into, and then ended up just thinking that we would bring in the standards from the model code, and then if it's something that Planning Commission wanted to start kind of removing some of those standards, you would have the authority to do that. or make that recommendation anyway.
I have Commissioner Taylor's hand raised and also Commissioner Ramey. I think, oh, sorry, Commissioner Ramey, yours was up first.
Well, so design standards, we could remove all of these, right? We could just say no design standards. Is that an option?
That's correct.
Okay, so then the dilemma is once you say you're going to have design standards, then what are they? And what we're hearing right now and experiencing is the difficulty in writing something that makes sense to the three-dimensional world and those of us that live in that world. So it's a very, very difficult thing to do, and it almost never works. And then, of course, there are alternative paths, but those are expensive and they take time. So there's always, you know, a loophole. There's a way out if you need it. My sense is that I don't know if I might have the ability, but in order to go back and rework all of these and to do it right, I would feel like I'd have to look at every single one of them, unless there were some obvious ones that were clearly not Eugene kind of stuff. And I don't know what that is exactly. I know that these were created by a board of designers and planners and architects and builders throughout the state. So a sort of well-equipped, knowledgeable board put these together. And to start taking them apart, I think is a daunting task. So for me, it's either all or none. I just don't feel like I really want to get into kind of trying to figure, unless there's some really clear, again, Commissioner Taylor, if there were like three things, like, okay, let's do that. But once we sort of walk into it, then I begin to have many more questions than three, you know. So, and I haven't read them with any detail. I read them enough to see that they could work. I understood the reasons for all of them. And I understood that that's an extra layer. Design standards are very difficult to do. But if we're going to have them, why not have a group that was made by a very capable board over a long period of time doing that? So with all that, I guess I'm sort of three minds. Either take them out altogether, leave them as they are, or find a very small subset of things that are just not Eugene. And hopefully we can find, if that's right, then I'm okay with sort of walking into changing them.
Commissioner Taylor.
I summarized at the end. I mean, I kind of agree. I don't kind of, Commissioner Ramey, I agree with you. And that's kind of why I didn't start to create my own code. My suggestion, and then Jeff, I would rely on you because once again, I'm concerned about, I don't want to be arbitrary and I haven't spent as much time as Jeff and Lauren, is I would eliminate B and eliminate 3A and 3B. Just eliminate the details of that. And it's basically saying, okay, you have to have at least one main entrance. The main entrance must face a street, be located on the angle, and you could say face a street and be within 8 feet, or be at an angle of 45 degrees, open onto a porch. That's it. In lieu of meeting A, B, or C above, or excuse me, it would basically be A and C above. Main entrances can also open up to a common courtyard. So you just eliminate the size of the porch. Don't micromanage the size of the porch. Don't micromanage that you have to be 8 feet of the longest street facing wall of the dwelling unit. Just say, hey, you gotta have a street. Then you've got the pedestrian connectivity. You've got, you know, that pedestrian scale of the street. I mean, I understand these design elements and functions. We have similar ones in the other sections of the code. For other zones, but that would be my suggestion. If we're not going to get into the weeds and you don't want to, or I would actually be comfortable eliminating them all.
I'm gonna just do a quick time check and let everybody know it's 7:56. We got 4 minutes left, and Commissioner Fragola.
So Commissioner Taylor, are those the only three that you wanted to eliminate out of everything? Because I think that falls into the category 3 that Commissioner Ramey was discussing, a small subset, a very small subset of all of the design standards. I personally, it sounds appealing to get rid of all the design standards and kind of a minimalist tendency that I do have, but I feel uncomfortable with it just because I don't know what I don't know. I literally don't know what I don't know. So I would be supportive of those 3 changes about entrances and porches, and then comfortable keeping the rest of the design standards, because I don't feel comfortable getting rid of all of them, honestly.
All right, so at this point, I'll at least take a poll on this. Commissioner Isaacson, please.
Just to jump on top of that, is what's the argument for keeping them, first of all? And 2, can we put that into our recommendations to council to say, look at getting rid of these when you have much more time to focus and drill down on them? If there's not a real need in it, they're more burdensome than anything else. And that way we have more time to examine them in depth with the data that's going to drive our decision, rather than kind of the 11th hour, well, let's just toss them all out, which obviously no one wants to do, but at least gives them a time to reflect and go, maybe we want to look at this and whether or not we will want to have them to begin with.
Lauren.
This doesn't directly follow in Commissioner Isaacson's comment, but I would note that there are similar entryway and porch standards for townhouses. And so if the commission is interested in eliminating those for triplexes and fourplexes, would you also be interested in eliminating them for townhouses? The cottage cluster standards are different enough that would be a separate discussion, I think, if Planning Commission is interested in delving into those.
Teresa.
I'd like to suggest, if people would agree, that we put this off and talk about it one more time. I've got a couple of other things I'd like to say about it. I also heard Commissioner Taylor say pretty clearly at the end of, I think, her last remarks, she'd be in favor of getting rid of all of them. I appreciate we want to be careful doing something like that, as Commissioner Fragala said, but I'm not sure we need to make a decision on it right now. I think we did really good work tonight, and we could talk about this next week or the week after.
I think that's a great point, and I would say that staff can absolutely bring back these changes. That Commissioner Taylor has suggested specifically tonight for the removal of those, and we can bring those back to the commission for their consideration, and you'll be actually able to see what that would look like. Obviously, staff's not going to take the time to just remove all the standards, because that would just be removing all the standards. So we'll go with the more nuanced approach. We can bring that back for our next deliberations. And Commissioner Taylor.
Yeah, if Jeff, if you feel comfortable, because I understand why that 8 foot is there in subsection B, you can embed it under subsection 3A. It talks about the front. You can just add that extra piece, because then those are a choice. Anyways, just you play with it.
I will look into that and provide that as an option potentially for our next meeting. So I'm going to hand it back to Terry to talk about next. It's 8 o'clock.
Oh, thank you. It went back to the beginning. Sorry about that. I'm gonna have to, don't look, I'll make you dizzy. But I have a slide at the end here. It's so weird. I don't know what's going on. Come on. Okay. I'm just gonna tell you, because it's being super weird. Here we go. So next meeting is next week, a week from tonight, December 14th. Then we have a break, and we come back January 11th, and we're scheduled for another meeting on January 25th. Earlier tonight, somebody made a mention of scheduling another meeting. We do have that flexibility at this point. We don't have more on the books, but we can easily add one, potentially January 18th if we need it. So put that in the back of your minds. And that is it. Oh, And we got a council work session on the calendar for March 9th. That is the first date that will be going to council, and I need to confirm that that would be your opportunity to have a joint discussion with them, but it is on the tentative working calendar for middle housing. And that's all I have.
Okay, good. I think we did a lot tonight. So we'll all be back here a week from tonight at 5:30. And thanks very much. And with that, I'll adjourn the meeting.